The day my father called me that again, the ceiling fan was ticking like a clock that had learned to breathe. It was late afternoon, the kind of hour when the light goes thin and everything looks like it's about to confess something. I was standing in his kitchen, holding a bag of oranges I'd brought because the doctor said he needed more vitamin C, and because I still believed at 34 years old that small gestures could soften old words. He didn't look at the oranges. He looked past me, at the window, at the dust caught in the sunbeam, and said, "You've always been different. You know why. You're the affair child." He said it the way some people say weather report, flat, certain, like it had been printed on me at birth. The fan kept ticking. My hands went numb. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I'd forgotten to buy bread. For 28 years, that sentence had been the shadow that followed me from room to room. It had been whispered when relatives thought I couldn't hear. It had been said out loud when my father was tired or angry or too honest with his own bitterness. It had been written into the way he looked at me, like I was a question he didn't want answered. And still, every time, it landed like a fresh bruise. I grew up in a house that smelled like lemon cleaner and boiled tea. My mother kept everything neat in the way people do when they're trying to hold a life together with both hands. Our living room had a sofa no one sat on and framed photos that stopped around the year my older brother, Daniel, turned 10. After that, there were fewer pictures. After that, there was more quiet. My father, Richard, used to come home with sawdust in his hair and stories about stubborn cabinets. He built things for other people's kitchens and broke things in ours. He wasn't a monster, that's important. He laughed at sitcoms and cried at old war movies and always paid in cash. But there was a thin, hard line in him like a fault in stone, and it ran straight through me. I was born 2 years after Daniel. According to the story that lived in the corners of our house, I arrived with a rumor attached. My mother never told me the details. She didn't have to. The way my father's jaw set when my name was said told me everything I needed to know about the shape of his doubt. At school, teachers would say, "You look just like your dad," and my father would tighten his grip on the steering wheel. At family dinners, an aunt would touch my hair and say, "She's got your eyes," and my father would get up to refill his glass. Once, when I was 12 and had stayed out too late with friends, he said, "I don't even know who you belong to," and then acted as if he hadn't said anything at all. My mother, Elaine, carried the truth, or whatever version of it she believed, like a fragile plate. She didn't set it down, she didn't show it to me, she just kept it balanced and kept moving. She worked mornings at the library and evenings at home, folding laundry with a precision that felt like prayer. When my father said those things, she would look at him, then at me, and say, "Richard," in a voice that meant, "Stop." Sometimes he did, sometimes he didn't. Daniel learned early how to be a bridge. He would pass me notes during dinner, bad drawings of our dog, a stick figure with a cape. He loved me in the way older brothers do, with half protective teasing and half quiet loyalty. But even he didn't argue the word. A fair child became a fact we orbited without touching. I left home at 18 with a suitcase that still smelled like lemon cleaner and the belief that distance might rewrite the story. I went to college, then to a job at a small architecture firm where I learned to read blueprints like maps of other people's hopes. I married a man named Thomas who cooked slowly and listened carefully. We had a daughter, Lucy, who said my name like it was a promise. For a while, the old word felt like a rumor from another life. But families are long roads. They curve back. When my father had his first small stroke, I was the one who drove to the hospital because my mother's hands were shaking too much to hold the keys. He squeezed my fingers in the ER and said my name like he was testing it. For months after, he was gentler. He asked about Lucy's school. He told me about a bird that nested in the oak tree behind their house. I let myself believe that time had sanded down the edge. Then my mother died on a Tuesday that smelled like rain. The house filled with casseroles and quiet. People told me I was strong. My father stood in the doorway like he had been set there and forgotten. After the funeral, when the rooms went hollow again, he moved through them like a man learning a new language. Sometimes he called me by my mother's name and then apologized. Sometimes he didn't speak at all. I started coming by every week with groceries, oranges, bread, soup he wouldn't eat. We talked about small things, the neighbor's dog, the price of gas, the way the oak tree had lost a limb in a storm. And then, on a thin afternoon with a ticking fan, he said the old sentence like he was putting a bookmark back in a book. "You've always been different. You know why. You're the affair child." I set the oranges on the counter. They rolled a little, bumped into each other, settled. "Dad," I said, and heard how small the word was. He didn't look at me. "Your mother," he stopped. Started again. "She was a good woman, but people make mistakes." Something in me finally made a sound. It wasn't a scream. It was quieter. It was the sound of a hinge deciding to move. "I've been saying this my whole life. You've never once told me what you think happened." He shrugged. The fan kept ticking. "Does it matter?" It did. It always had. That night, I drove home with the radio off. Thomas met me at the door, took my bag, asked how he was. I said, "The same." And then, after Lucy went to bed, I said, "He said it again." Thomas didn't fill the space with advice. He made tea. He sat with me on the couch and waited. I thought about my mother's hands, always busy. I thought about the photos that stopped. I thought about the way my father had flinched when people said I looked like him. And for the first time, I wondered, not in a passing self-protective way, but in a steady, adult way, what the truth actually was. Not to prove him wrong, not to punish anyone, just to know what my name meant in my own story. A week later, Daniel called. We talked about the oak tree and the roof leak and the way grief changes the weather inside a house. Before he hung up, he said, "He said it again, didn't he?" I didn't answer right away. The fan in my memory kept ticking. "I'm tired," I said finally. "I'm tired of not knowing." There was a pause on the line, the kind that holds a decision. "If you ever want to find out," he said, "I'll do it with you." That night, after the dishes were done and the house had gone quiet, I opened my laptop and typed words that felt like I was walking into a cold room. DNA test, siblings, paternity, accuracy. The screen glowed. Lucy's nightlight hummed down the hall. Thomas stood behind me and put his hands on my shoulders like he was bracing me against a wind. I didn't tell my father, not yet. Some truths need a door. The kit arrived in a plain brown envelope that looked like it had been mailed by someone who didn't want to be remembered. I left it on the kitchen counter for a day, walking past it like it might say something if I listened too closely. The instructions were simple, too simple for something that felt like it could rearrange the furniture of my life. Swab the cheek, seal the tube, mail it back, wait. Waiting has a sound. It's the low electric hum of the refrigerator at midnight. It's the click of the hallway light when you turn it off and still stand there, not ready for dark. It's the way your own name feels heavier when you say it. Daniel came over the following Saturday with a box of donuts and that careful look he gets when he's trying not to be the oldest brother. We sat at the table where our mother used to sort mail into tidy piles, and we opened the kits like we were unwrapping something fragile. He joked about how we should have brushed our teeth more. I told him to stop stalling. We laughed, and then we didn't. We swabbed our cheeks in silence. The cotton tasted like paper and nerves. When we sealed the tubes, Daniel held his like it might be warm. "You know," he said, "this doesn't change anything between us." "I know," I said, and meant it. We mailed them together. The mailbox on the corner had a dent like a dimple. Daniel pushed the envelope in and stood there for a second as if listening for it to land. "Whatever it says," he said, "we'll deal with it." At home, I tried to return to ordinary life. I went to work and argued gently with a client about window placement. I picked Lucy up from school and listened to a story about a goldfish that refused to die. Thomas made soup and pretended not to watch my hands when I set the table. At night, I lay awake and replayed small scenes like they were clues. My father's jaw, my mother's silence, the way relatives said "you look like him" like it was a dare. Weeks stretched like taffy. The company sent cheerful emails about processing times. I stopped opening them. In the meantime, my father's health began to wobble in the quiet way things do before they fall. He forgot appointments. He put the kettle on and walked away. I found a burn mark on the counter one morning and didn't tell him about it. He sat in his chair and watched the oak tree as if it were a channel he couldn't change. "You should move in with us," I said once, standing in the doorway with my coat still on, "at least for a while." He looked at me then, really looked. "You always were practical," he said. It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't an insult. It was a habit. The day the email finally came, I was in the grocery store staring at apples like they were an exam I hadn't studied for. My phone buzzed. Subject line, "Your results are ready." The words were neat and polite. My hands were not. I didn't open it there. I drove home with the apples rolling in the passenger seat and the radio off. Thomas was in the yard trying to convince a stubborn hedge to be less ambitious. He saw my face and came inside with me without asking questions. We sat at the kitchen table. The house was quiet in the way it gets when Lucy is at a friend's and the clock feels too loud. I opened the email. The screen took a second to load. My heart tried to get out through my throat. It said, "Full siblings, 99.98% probability." I stared at it like it might be a typo. I read it again and again. "Daniel and I, full siblings, same mother, same father." Thomas let out a breath he'd been holding for a decade. I laughed once, a short sound that didn't know where to go. Then I cried, the kind that feels like your ribs are remembering something. "That's it?" Thomas said softly. "That's it," I said. "That's everything." I called Daniel. He answered on the second ring like he'd been carrying the phone in his hand. "Got it?" he asked. "Full," I said. "We're full." There was a pause, and then a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been relief finding its way out. "Told you," he said, not in a teasing way, in a brother way. We talked about our mother for a while, about the way she cut sandwiches into triangles because it felt kinder, about the way she hummed when she folded towels, about the way she had stood in doorways and said our father's name like it was a hand on his arm. After I hung up, I sat with the knowledge like it was a glass of water I'd been thirsty for without knowing. It didn't erase the past. It didn't put the photos back on the wall, but it did something quieter. It put my name back in my own mouth. Telling my father felt like walking toward a storm that had learned my schedule. I didn't do it right away. I watched him forget where he put his keys, then accuse the cat. I listened to him tell the same story about a cabinet job 3 times in one afternoon. I brought soup and oranges and bread and waited for a day that felt like a door instead of a wall. It came on a Wednesday when the oak dropped another limb and the yard smelled like fresh sap. He was sitting at the table with a stack of unpaid bills, moving them into piles that didn't make sense. "Your mother used to handle this," he said, not looking at me. "I know," I said. I took a breath that went all the way down. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something." He frowned, as if bracing for weather. "Make it quick." I took a DNA test and felt how strange it was to put those words in that room. Daniel did too. He looked up then. The fan wasn't on, but I could hear it in my head. And we're full siblings, same father. The room did a small, quiet thing, like a picture shifting on a wall. He stared at me. His mouth opened and closed once. "Those things," he said, They're not always accurate. This one is. It's not a guess, it's not a story, it's math. He pushed his chair back and stood, then sat again. Your mother, he stopped. He looked at his hands like they were strangers. Why are you telling me this? Because for 28 years you've called me something that isn't true, because I've carried it like a second spine, because I want you to stop, because I want to know what you'll do when the story changes. I'm telling you because it matters. He was quiet for a long time. The oak creaked outside. A car passed. Finally, he said, You always did look like me. The words were small. They didn't apologize. They didn't fix anything. But they were different from the weather report. They were a crack. I'm not here to fight, I said. I'm here to put this down. He nodded once, as if to himself. Leave it on the table, he said. I'll read it. I left the printed results next to the bills and the pen that never worked. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I went home and sat on my own couch and listened to my house breathe. That night, Daniel texted, How did it go? I wrote, He didn't throw it away. Sometimes, that's the beginning. The kit arrived in a plain brown envelope that looked like it had been mailed by someone who didn't want to be remembered. I left it on the kitchen counter for a day, walking past it like it might say something if I listened too closely. The instructions were simple, too simple for something that felt like it could rearrange the furniture of my life. Swab the cheek, seal the tube, mail it back, wait. Waiting has a sound. It's the low electric hum of the refrigerator at midnight. It's the click of the hallway light when you turn it off and still stand there, not ready for dark. It's the way your own name feels heavier when you say it. Daniel came over the following Saturday with a box of donuts and that careful look he gets when he's trying not to be the oldest brother. We sat at the table where our mother used to sort mail into tidy piles, and we opened the kits like we were unwrapping something fragile. He joked about how we should have brushed our teeth more. I told him to stop stalling. We laughed, and then we didn't. We swabbed our cheeks in silence. The cotton tasted like paper and nerves. When we sealed the tubes, Daniel held his like it might be warm. You know, he said, this doesn't change anything between us. I know, I said, and meant it. We mailed them together. The mailbox on the corner had a dent like a dimple. Daniel pushed the envelope in and stood there for a second, as if listening for it to land. Whatever it says, he said, we'll deal with it. At home, I tried to return to ordinary life. I went to work and argued gently with a client about window placement. I picked Lucy up from school and listened to a story about a goldfish that refused to die. Thomas made soup and pretended not to watch my hands when I set the table. At night, I lay awake and replayed small scenes like they were clues. My father's jaw, my mother's silence, the way relatives said, "You look like him," like it was a dare. Weeks stretched like taffy. The company sent cheerful emails about processing times. I stopped opening them. In the meantime, my father's health began to wobble in the quiet way things do before they fall. He forgot appointments. He put the kettle on and walked away. I found a burn mark on the counter one morning and didn't tell him about it. He sat in his chair and watched the oak tree as if it were a channel he couldn't change. You should move in with us, I said once, standing in the doorway with my coat still on, at least for a while. He looked at me then, really looked. You always were practical, he said. It wasn't a compliment, it wasn't an insult, it was a habit. The day the email finally came, I was in the grocery store staring at apples like they were an exam I hadn't studied for. My phone buzzed. Subject line, your results are ready. The words were neat and polite. My hands were not. I didn't open it there. I drove home with the apples rolling in the passenger seat and the radio off. Thomas was in the yard trying to convince a stubborn hedge to be less ambitious. He saw my face and came inside with me without asking questions. We sat at the kitchen table. The house was quiet in the way it gets when Lucy is at a friend's and the clock feels too loud. I opened the email. The screen took a second to load. My heart tried to get out through my throat. It said, full siblings, 99.98% probability. I stared at it like it might be a typo. I read it again and again. Daniel and I, full siblings, same mother, same father. Thomas let out a breath he'd been holding for a decade. I laughed, once, a short sound that didn't know where to go. Then I cried, the kind that feels like your ribs are remembering something. "That's it?" Thomas said softly. "That's it. That's everything." I called Daniel. He answered on the second ring like he'd been carrying the phone in his hand. "Got it?" he asked. "Full," I said. "We're full." There was a pause, and then a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been relief finding its way out. "Told you," he said, not in a teasing way, in a brother way. We talked about our mother for a while, about the way she cut sandwiches into triangles because it felt kinder, about the way she hummed when she folded towels, about the way she had stood in doorways and said our father's name like it was a hand on his arm. After I hung up, I sat with the knowledge like it was a glass of water I'd been thirsty for without knowing. It didn't erase the past, it didn't put the photos back on the wall, but it did something quieter. It put my name back in my own mouth. Telling my father felt like walking toward a storm that had learned my schedule. I didn't do it right away. I watched him forget where he put his keys and then accuse the cat. I listened to him tell the same story about a cabinet job 3 times in an afternoon. I brought soup and oranges and bread and waited for a day that felt like a door instead of a wall. It came on a Wednesday when the oak dropped another limb and the yard smelled like fresh sap. He was sitting at the table with a stack of unpaid bills, moving them into piles that didn't make sense. "Your mother used to handle this," he said, not looking at me. "I know," I said. I took a breath that went all the way down. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something." He frowned as if bracing for weather. "Make it quick." "I took a DNA test," I said, and felt how strange it was to put those words in that room. Daniel did too. He looked up then. The fan wasn't on, but I could hear it in my head. And we're full siblings, same father." The room did a small, quiet thing, like a picture shifting on a wall. He stared at me. His mouth opened and closed once. "Those things," he said, "they're not always accurate. This one is. It's not a guess. It's not a story. It's math." He pushed his chair back and stood, then sat again. "Your mother—" He stopped. He looked at his hands like they were strangers. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because for 28 years you've called me something that isn't true, because I've carried it like a second spine, because I want you to stop, because I want to know what you'll do when the story changes. I'm telling you because it matters." He was quiet for a long time. The oak creaked outside. A car passed. Finally, he said, "You always did look like me." The words were small. They didn't apologize. They didn't fix anything. But they were different from the weather report. They were a crack. "I'm not here to fight," I said. "I'm here to put this down." He nodded once, as if to himself. "Leave it on the table," he said. I'll read it." I left the printed results next to the bills and the pen that never worked. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I went home and sat on my own couch and listened to my house breathe. That night, Daniel texted, "How did it go?" I wrote, "He didn't throw it away." Sometimes that's the beginning. My father didn't call the next day, or the day after that. The silence had a weight to it, like a coat you forget you're wearing until you try to move your arms. I kept busy in the careful way people do when they're waiting for news they can't control. I reorganized a closet that didn't need it. I baked bread and forgot the salt. I stood at the window and watched the hedge surrender one leaf at a time. When the phone finally rang, it wasn't him. It was Mrs. Calder from 2 houses down, her voice tight with the kind of politeness that means trouble. "He fell," she said. "Your father. He's awake, but he's confused. The ambulance is here." Hospitals have a particular smell, clean and old fear. I found him in a room with a curtain that wouldn't close all the way. His face looked smaller, like someone had turned down a dimmer. He smiled at me and said, "Elaine," and then, "No, wait," and then nothing at all. The doctor said it was another small stroke, nothing dramatic, everything important. He would need someone with him for a while, someone to make sure the kettle didn't get forgotten, someone to notice when the world went sideways. He came home with a walker and a list of instructions that might as well have been a second language. I moved into the spare room with the curtains that still held my mother's quiet. I told myself it was temporary. I told Thomas and Lucy stories over the phone about how he was improving. I told myself I wasn't running from anything. The envelope with the test results stayed on the table where I'd left it. It gathered a soft, visible layer of dust, like proof that time was passing even when nothing else was. Sometimes I saw him glance at it. Sometimes he moved it an inch to the left as if the table needed room to breathe. One afternoon, while I was cutting apples too thin, he said, "Your brother called." My hand slipped. The knife nicked the board. What did he say? "He's got a good job," my father said, "that his kid's learning to ride a bike, that he hopes I'm behaving." He paused. "He asked if you were there." "And?" "I said you were," he said. "I said you always show up." It wasn't an apology, it wasn't a confession, but it was a sentence that didn't have the old word in it. I set the apples down and waited. He didn't add anything. The kettle began to scream. I turned it off. We fell into a rhythm that felt like learning a new dance with a partner who'd forgotten some of the steps. I made lists, he pretended not to need them. We watched the same news twice. We argued gently about whether the oak would survive another winter. At night, I lay in the spare room and listened to the house make its careful sounds. One evening, as the light thinned, he said, "Your mother used to hum in this room." "I know," I said. "She still does." He looked at me puzzled. "In my head," I said, and smiled so he would know it wasn't a ghost story. He nodded. "She had good hands." "Yes," I said, "she did." He reached for the envelope then, finally. He didn't open it. He turned it over like a postcard from a place he'd never planned to visit. He said, "I was wrong," and the words fell like a dropped plate, simple, breakable, loud in the quiet. I waited. He didn't say anything else. Sometimes that's all a person has. "I don't need you to be perfect," I said. "I need you to be done with that story." He put the envelope back down. He said, "I was young," which was not a reason. He added, "People talk," which was not an answer. Then he surprised both of us by saying, "I was afraid." "Of what?" I asked. "Of not being enough," he said, and his voice went thin. "Of being fooled, of being replaced." He gestured vaguely toward the place where my mother used to be. It was easier to keep a distance than to admit I didn't know how to stay. The fan in my head stopped ticking. I said, "You didn't keep a distance, you kept a wound." He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet in a way that didn't perform for anyone. He said, "I don't know how to fix it." I said, "Start by not calling me that. Start by saying my name." He tried it like someone testing a bridge with a foot. He said my name. It didn't break. That was the beginning of a smaller, harder work. It didn't look like a movie. It looked like him asking about Lucy's spelling test and listening to the answer. It looked like him letting me pay the bills without making a joke about it. It looked like him telling the neighbor when she asked, "Your daughter staying with you?" "Yes," he said, "my daughter." Word moves in small towns like weather. It doesn't ask permission. My aunt stopped by with a pie and a look that wanted to measure me. "Heard you took one of those tests," she said, too casually. "I did." She pursed her lips. "Well, I always said you had his chin." I smiled because sometimes the best thing you can do is not let someone finish a story they don't own anymore. The first real test came at a family dinner Daniel organized for his birthday. He invited everyone in a hopeful, stubborn way. I almost didn't go. My father insisted. "We should," he said. "We can't keep hiding." The table was too full and the room too loud. Someone brought up the oak tree. Someone asked about Lucy. My aunt asked, "So," and let the word hang like a hook. "So I hear there was some clarification?" Daniel looked at me. I looked at my father. He cleared his throat. "There was," he said. "We were wrong." He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at his plate. I was wrong. It wasn't a speech, it wasn't a miracle, but the room shifted. My aunt blinked. Someone changed the subject. The cake came out and had too much frosting. Lucy got frosting on her nose and everyone laughed in the way people do when they're relieved to laugh about anything else. On the drive home, Daniel said, "That took guts." It took time and a lot of dust. Weeks turned. Change doesn't announce itself. It starts with small negotiations. Mine began with a calendar and a quiet argument with myself. I circled dates in pencil. I erased them. Thomas had been patient in the way people are when they're holding a door open and don't want to say their arms are tired. Lucy started asking when I was coming home for real, which is a question that sounds like a child's and feels like a mirror. My father, for his part, began doing things that looked like planning. He wrote lists. He asked the neighbor for help with the yard. He learned how to use the microwave without pressing every button. One afternoon, he said, "You should go back to your life," and said it like he was giving me a gift instead of admitting he was afraid of being alone. "I'm not disappearing," I said. "I'm just changing zip codes." He nodded. "I know." We set a date. It landed with a soft thud in my chest. The night before I left, we ate soup and didn't talk much. The house had learned our footsteps. It didn't want to unlearn them. In the morning, Daniel came by to help carry boxes that were mostly excuses. Extra blankets, books I'd already read, a lamp that had been my mother's. My father stood on the porch and watched like a man at a train station pretending not to check the schedule. "Call me when you get there," he said. "I will," I said, "and I'll be back next weekend." He nodded. "Drive safe," he said, which is a prayer. Going home felt like opening a window. Thomas hugged me in the doorway with the careful strength of someone who has practiced waiting. Lucy showed me a drawing of our house with 3 sons and said, "I put one for Grandpa." I put it on the fridge. For a while, life was ordinary in a way that felt earned. Work deadlines, school projects, grocery lists. On Sundays, I drove back to my father's with soup and oranges and bread because some rituals are also promises. We talked about the oak, which had decided to live. We argued about news we both pretended not to watch. He started telling me stories about his childhood that didn't make him the hero. Then the call came from a number I didn't recognize. It was Marjorie Wells again, her voice smaller this time. "I'm moving into assisted living," she said. "I wanted to say, I'm glad you told him." "Me too," I said. "There's one more thing," she said. "In the box, a letter that isn't addressed. It's from him, from your father, to your mother. He never sent it." I found it that night in the bottom of the box, which I had kept like a library book overdue. The envelope was unsealed. The paper inside smelled like time. He wrote, "I don't know how to ask you to stay without sounding like I'm keeping score." He wrote, "I'm trying to learn your language." I didn't tell him I'd read it. Some things are bridges you don't announce yourself crossing. The real test of our new story came in a place that smelled like coffee and varnish, a small community meeting about zoning changes that would affect his street. He insisted on going. "I have opinions," he said, like a teenager. A man from the neighborhood stood up and said, "We don't need outsiders telling us how to live." It wasn't about me. It wasn't not about me either. The room did that quiet shift it does when a story is looking for a place to land. My father raised his hand, and when he spoke, his voice didn't hurry. He said, "My daughter lives here, and she doesn't. Both are true. We can make room for both." Someone snorted. Someone else nodded. The meeting moved on, but I sat there with a cup of bad coffee and felt something settle that had been standing for years. Later in the parking lot, he said, "I practiced that in my head. I could tell you didn't trip over the word." He smiled, the small, surprised one. "I'm getting better." Not everything was neat. He forgot sometimes and called Lucy by my name and then apologized twice. He still moved things on the table like the envelope had taught him. Once, in a moment that felt like an old ghost stretching, he said, "You know, people used to," and stopped. "Never mind." "Finish it," I said. He looked at me. "No," he said. "I'm done telling that story." The house, it turned out, had a longer memory than people. A neighbor stopped me one afternoon and said, "I always wondered," and let the sentence hang like laundry. I smiled and said, "Wonder is a hobby," and kept walking. Daniel started bringing his kid on weekends. The oak got a new swing. My father learned how to push without counting. Once he told Lucy, "You look like your mother," meaning me, and I pretended not to hear the way my chest answered. We never had a big cinematic apology. We had small daily ones. We had soup. We had names said correctly. We had photos in frames and letters in boxes, and a calendar with dates in pen. One evening, while we were watching the news we pretended not to watch, he said, "I thought certainty was strength." And, I asked. "And it was just loud. Quiet is harder, but it fits." I thought about my mother's humming, about Daniel's pause on the phone, about a DNA test that had put math where a rumor had been living. "Quiet keeps better," I said. He nodded. "It does." When I drove home that night, the road felt like a ribbon laid down for a reason. I called Thomas and told him I was bringing leftovers. He said, "We'll make room." That's how it works, I think. You don't replace old stories. You make room until they learn to sit differently. The truth has a way of finding a stage even when you don't buy tickets. It started with a post on the community board. Someone had scanned a page from the meeting minutes and added a caption that tried to be helpful and landed somewhere between curious and cruel. So, turns out Richard's affair child isn't an affair child at all. Who knew? The comment thread filled with the usual small-town chorus, shrugs, judgments, people correcting each other's grammar like it was a moral stance. Daniel called first. "You seen this?" "I have now," I said. "Do you want me to?" "No," I said. "Let it be loud. It'll get tired." But loud things don't get tired. They find better microphones. At the grocery store, a woman I barely knew said, "Well, that must be a relief," like she was commenting on a weather change. At Lucy's school pickup, another parent said, "Kids are resilient, right?" and smiled in a way that wanted credit for trying. I practiced a sentence in my head, "It was never mine to carry," and didn't say it. My father took it harder than I did. He sat in his chair and watched the oak and said, "I did this," like he was counting nails. "I said it first. I made it a thing people could pass around." "You also ended it," I said. "Doesn't matter," he said. "You don't get points for stopping a fire you started." The next day, he did something that felt like both an apology and a dare. He wrote a letter to the local paper. He kept it short. He didn't explain the letters or Marjorie or the winter the pipes froze. He wrote, "For years, I called my daughter something that wasn't true. It hurt her and it taught others to repeat it. A DNA test didn't change who she is. It changed who I was willing to be. I'm sorry." He signed his name. The editor called, asked if he was sure. My father said yes. The paper ran it on page 3 between a lost dog and a fundraiser. The town read it the way towns read things, quickly, with opinions. Some people said it was brave, some said it was unnecessary. A man at the hardware store said, "Took you long enough," and my father said yes, and bought nails. At Lucy's school, the principal asked if everything was okay at home in the careful way people do when they're trying to be kind without being curious. "It is," I said. "We're just loud right now." "Quiet will come," she said, like a proverb. It did, eventually. The board post slid down the page, the comments found a new argument, the grocery store went back to apples being just apples, but something had shifted in the way people looked at my father, not better, not worse, more honest. He was a man who had said something wrong for a long time and then said it was wrong out loud. We felt the shift at Thanksgiving when an uncle said, "Pass the salt," and didn't add anything else. We felt it when my aunt brought pie and said, "I heard," and then said, "I'm glad," and then said nothing. We felt it when Daniel's kid asked, "Why do people call Grandpa loud?" And Daniel said, "Because he used to be, and now he's learning." My father took to walking in the evenings. Sometimes I went with him. We talked about nothing, about the way sidewalks are small maps, about how you can tell what kind of dog lives in a house by the way the fence is repaired. Once he said, "I wish your mother could see this." I said, "She does," and pointed to my chest. "She's nosy." He laughed, a real one. One night, a neighbor stopped us and said, "Hey, Richard, read your letter. Took guts." My father nodded. "Took time," he said, and kept walking. It was the same sentence I'd used, and it felt like a bridge passing a bridge. The public part of this story ended not with a bang, but with a potluck. Someone organized one for the block. There were folding tables and mismatched chairs, and a woman who insisted her potato salad was a family secret. My father stood up to thank everyone for coming and forgot what he was going to say. He looked at me. "Words," he said. "You don't owe anyone a speech," I said. He nodded. "Then I won't give one." He sat. The oak held its leaves like it was trying to be polite. People ate. Kids ran. Someone put on music too quietly. Life insisted on itself again. Later, as we were packing up, a woman I'd never met said, "You're his daughter, right?" "Yes," I said. "He talks about you," she said, "in a way that sounds like he's learning a language." I smiled. "We both are." Driving home, I realized the town didn't own the ending of this story. It could watch, it could comment, but it couldn't decide what we kept. That night, my father called and said, "I found a picture you'd like." He described it badly. "You're about this tall," he said, holding the phone like I could see. "Your mother is laughing at something I'm not in on." "I'll come get it," I said. "You don't have to," he said. "I can bring it." "Okay," I said. "Bring it." When he arrived, he didn't just bring the picture, he brought soup, old habits. We sat at my table. He watched Lucy do homework like it was a show. He said, "You've made a good house." "We've made room," I said. He nodded. "That seems to be the trick." Before he left, he stood in the doorway like he used to, and then didn't. He hugged me, carefully, like a man learning how to hold something without measuring it. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For staying," he said, "and for leaving, both." When he drove away, the street went back to being a street, the oak went back to being a tree, and my name went back to being a name that fit. Would you like me to continue to part 7? Healing doesn't look like forgetting, it looks like remembering without flinching. The months that followed were quiet in the good way, like a house after guests leave and the dishes are done. My father's health steadied into something like a routine. He still needed reminders. He still pretended he didn't. We negotiated the small things: who drove, who paid, who brought dessert. We learned slowly how not to keep score. At work, I took on a project that required more travel, and I said yes with the old ache that came with leaving. Thomas noticed before I did. "You're lighter," he said one night as we folded laundry, "or maybe you're just not carrying a sentence around anymore." Lucy started asking questions in the way kids do when they sense a story but don't know where to begin. "Why did Grandpa used to be loud?" she asked, tracing a circle on the table with her finger. "Because he was scared," I said, "and because nobody taught him a quieter way." "Is he still scared?" "Sometimes," I said, "but now he knows what to do with it." She thought about that. "I get scared of the dark," she said. "I know," I said. "We leave a light on." "Does Grandpa have a light?" "He does," I said, and smiled because the answer had become true. Daniel came over one Sunday with his kid and a box of old board games. We found one that still had all its pieces and argued about the rules. My father watched, then joined, then cheated badly and laughed when we caught him. I was always good at cabinets. Games, not so much. We took pictures, not because we were trying to prove anything, because it was Sunday and the light was kind. The anniversary of my mother's death arrived like a letter you recognize before you open. We went to the cemetery together. The grass had been cut too short. The stone was cool. My father stood there for a long time and then said, "I'm sorry," in a way that didn't need a recipient. He put the picture he'd found into the little holder and stepped back like he was giving her room to breathe. On the drive home, he said, "I used to think I was the main character." "And now?" I asked. "And now I think I'm a chapter," he said, "not even a long one." "Chapters matter," I said. "So do footnotes," he said, and surprised me. We started a small ritual: soup on Sundays, walks on Wednesdays, photos on the fridge that changed with the seasons. Sometimes he would start a sentence the old way and stop. Sometimes I would feel the old ache and let it pass like a car I didn't need to chase. One afternoon, a client asked me, "Isn't that your father?" in a coffee shop. My father was at the counter, arguing politely about a lid. "Yes," I said. "He seems different," the client said, searching for a word not to offend. "So am I said. The project at work took me out of town for a week. My father texted once a day, which for him was a minor miracle. "Oak still standing. Your soup is better than the stores. Lucy beat me at cards." When I came back, he had fixed a hinge that had been squeaking for years. He said, "I got tired of listening to it." "Welcome to my life," I said, and we laughed. The story didn't end with a ribbon. It ended with a calendar that had normal things on it: dentist appointments, a birthday circled in blue, a note that said "bring bread." It ended with a name that no longer had an asterisk. One evening, as we were washing dishes, he said, "If I could go back." I said, "You can't," gently. "No," he said, "but I can go forward without pretending." "That's the only direction that counts," I said. He nodded. "Your mother would have liked that." "She did," I said. "She just didn't always get to hear it." Later, when the house was quiet and Thomas was reading and Lucy was asleep, I sat at the table with the old box of letters. I didn't read them. I put them back in order and tied the ribbon again. Some truths are for carrying, some are for shelving. I thought about the sentence that had followed me for 28 years and how it had finally learned to leave. I thought about the fan that used to tick in my head and how quiet had moved in without asking for rent. I thought about how stories change not when you tear them up, but when you write the next one in ink. The next morning, the world has a way of repeating what it thinks it knows, even when you've already proven it wrong. It started subtly. Someone at church whispered when my father walked by, "So, the story wasn't true?" Their eyes were curious, the kind that wants scandal. I kept my head down and nodded politely, because sometimes silence is a better response than argument. Then it spread. Someone posted about it online. Nothing malicious, just a small-town Facebook post that said, Turns out Elaine isn't Richard's affair child. DNA confirms. Who knew? Comments poured in. Some congratulated me, others argued. Some speculated about how my mother would have reacted. My father, for his part, didn't want to look at it. Ignore it, he said. It'll pass. But the world doesn't pass so easily. At the grocery store, a cashier smiled nervously and said, "I heard about the DNA thing. I'm glad it's true." I smiled back, tasting a strange mix of exhaustion and vindication. One morning, a neighbor came by with a pie and a small stack of envelopes. "I think these came for you," she said, like she was offering evidence instead of dessert. They were letters, congratulatory notes from distant relatives, old friends, even people I barely remembered from school. Most had started with, "I'm sorry," or "I didn't know." Some had started with curiosity that could easily turn judgmental if left unchecked. We sorted them carefully on the kitchen table. My father helped, slowly. He shuffled envelopes as if they were fragile documents in a courtroom. "Some of them," he said, "still sound like they think I was right." "Let them think what they want," I said. "We know the truth." It was harder for him. Every comment, every sideways glance felt like a reminder of his own words from decades ago. I watched him shrink and straighten at the same time, like he was learning how to carry accountability in a way that didn't crush him. The town meeting came next. Someone had slipped a printed copy of the DNA results into the local newsletter. Half the town showed up, curious. Some were angry, others amused. And there he was, my father, standing, shaking a little, looking out at the room that had once nodded along to a story that wasn't true. He spoke slowly. "I called my daughter names," he said, "for too long. I told a story that was not hers, and I let it shape what people thought about her. That was wrong. I am sorry." Silence followed, then a murmur, then a kind of quiet nodding, the way a room does when it sees someone finally stand in their own error. Daniel whispered to me, "He's doing it. He's actually doing it." It was true. For the first time, my father didn't just acknowledge the past in private, he took responsibility in public. And the world, as unpredictable as it is, began to respond differently. Some people avoided the topic completely, some apologized for gossip, and a few, the stubborn ones, said nothing at all, but at least they no longer carried it as truth. My father, and by extension me, had reclaimed the story. The ripple effects were slower than I expected. A cousin stopped calling me the other child. The PTA president greeted me with a sincere smile. Even the neighbor who used to nod with an air of judgment finally said, "Glad that's settled. You deserve that, Elaine." But the largest shift was in him. He began telling small, careful stories about me, not as someone to compare or measure, but as someone he loved. He told friends about Lucy's first spelling test. He bragged about Daniel's new job, and he even admitted to the neighbor that he had been wrong, without excuses. It was awkward at first. Humility rarely feels comfortable. He stumbled over sentences, paused, corrected himself, but each time he spoke, he chipped away at the weight he had carried and that I had carried with him for decades. One evening, after sorting letters and news clippings, he said quietly, "I never realized how heavy a story could be until I made it mine." "You made it yours?" I asked. "Yes," he said, "and now I'm learning to set it down." There's a strange beauty in watching someone confront their own public failure. My father had been called many things, had called me many things, and yet here he was, facing every witness, standing quietly, accepting accountability without trying to rewrite history. It was something I had waited decades to see. Even in the grocery store, life shifted. People greeted me differently. Some nodded, hesitant. Some smiled freely. The world didn't instantly forgive him, but it began to respect that he had spoken the truth. And me? I began to feel lighter, like a window that had been closed for too long was finally cracked open. Daniel came over that night. He's never seen him like this, so calm and still himself. Yes, I said, he's learning how to be human in public, not just private. We poured tea. Lucy ran around, giggling, with frosting still on her cheeks. My father tried to chase her, missed once, and laughed. That sound, unguarded and soft, was worth more than any apology note. By the end of the week, the letters were filed away. My father even framed one, a simple note that said, "I am sorry," in his hand. He hung it in the kitchen where the sunlight caught it in the morning. A quiet reminder that public truth is sometimes harder than private, but also that it is transformative. Through all of it, I realized something important. Accountability in public doesn't erase the past, but it clears the space for something new. It lets the next generation, Lucy, Daniel, even me, see that mistakes can be faced, not repeated, and that truth spoken aloud has the power to change how people see each other. That's the lesson I carry now, the one I hope others carry too. Your story is yours. Other people can comment, speculate, or misjudge, but ultimately, only you and those you love get to define what it means. And for the first time, I truly felt that freedom, not in anger, not in confrontation, but in the quiet way a house breathes when the wind finally finds a window left open. I often think about how stories follow us like shadows. Some shadows are gentle, like a late afternoon sun stretching across the floor, and some shadows are heavy, like doors that refuse to open. The one that haunted me for 28 years, being called the affair child, was the kind of shadow that collects dust in the corners of your mind. It shapes how you sit at tables, how you answer questions, how you let yourself be seen. And for a long time, it felt permanent. I remember the first time I really understood the weight of that word. I was 12, sitting on the steps of our porch with scraped knees and a book I didn't open. My father came outside and didn't see the blood on my knees, didn't notice my crooked braids. He just said it, again, like he'd said it 1,000 times before, like he was rehearsing a truth that belonged to someone else. And I swallowed it whole, thinking maybe it was my fault. Maybe I was the story, not the person. Years later, when I stood with the DNA test results in my hand, I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel victory. I felt the quiet tremor of relief, not just for me, but for the truth itself. Truth, I realized, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it takes decades to find its voice. The process of telling my father, of seeing him finally acknowledge what he had said for so long, was the hardest part. There was fear, yes, but also hope. Every week I visited him after that, soup in hand, letters in the box, photos waiting to be framed. We rebuilt not a perfect relationship, but one that could breathe, one that could sit with its own mistakes and say, "I am still learning." It was the slowest, quietest revolution I've ever been part of. Family doesn't always heal in the ways we expect. It heals in the spaces between words, in the patience of ordinary gestures, in soup bowls passed across a table. My father learned that. My father, who had once been certain that I was other, now calls me by my name with intention, like a man practicing honesty. He listens to Lucy's stories about school, asks her questions about her goldfish, and sometimes even smiles at Daniel's bad jokes. He is still human, still flawed, but the shadow of doubt is lighter now, and for that I am grateful. What surprised me most through all of this was the way the world around us reacts to truth. The neighbors, the distant relatives, the online comments, they don't get to decide what your life means. They can whisper, speculate, or applaud, but the story that matters is the one you live quietly, day by day. Our story changed not because people saw it, but because we acted, because we confronted the past and carried it forward without letting it crush us. The letters from my mother and the ones that Marjorie Wells brought forward are now tucked into a box on a shelf that catches the afternoon light. I don't need to read them every day. They are proof, not punctuation. They remind me that love and intention, even when tangled with fear and misunderstanding, leave traces. They remind me that mistakes are human, but so is accountability. And above all, they remind me that no one has the right to define you before you know yourself. Sometimes I still feel the old ache when I pass a photo or hear someone misstate the story, but now it's easier to let it pass like wind over a calm lake. I recognize the difference between blame and lesson. I recognize that forgiveness is not forgetting, it's choosing to hold the other person accountable without letting them live inside your chest. I recognize that you can't fix the past, but you can give the future a better shape. Lucy doesn't understand all of it yet. She only knows that Grandpa sometimes calls her by the wrong name and then laughs and corrects himself. She knows that family isn't always easy, but it is ours, and in that there is simplicity and peace. One day I hope she understands that our names, our identities, are ours alone, that truth is not a gift from others, it's something we claim, carefully, one breath at a time. Looking back, I see the arc of my life as a series of small reckonings, leaving home, choosing Thomas, standing up to my father, taking the DNA test, opening letters, learning how to carry anger without letting it define me. Each step was ordinary in its execution, but monumental in its effect. And when I see my father today, smiling at Lucy's goldfish antics or fumbling with the kettle, I see a man who has learned, painfully and beautifully, that certainty can be a cage and humility can be freedom. I tell this story not to humiliate or shame, not to seek applause or pity, but because I want someone else who has been carrying a shadow to hear it, to know that even the deepest doubts, even the names we are forced to wear, can be unclaimed, that patience, courage, and a quiet insistence on truth can change a lifetime, that you can confront history without losing yourself, that the world may notice or it may not, but it does not get the final say. So here I am, at the kitchen table, the same table that held the envelope of DNA results years ago. The sun catches the rim of Lucy's cup. The oak outside sways like it's nodding at me. My father is in the other room, and he calls my name correctly without hesitation. And for the first time in decades, the sound belongs entirely to me. I wonder sometimes, how long do we carry the names given to us by fear? How many years do we spend believing stories that belong to someone else? I can't answer that for anyone else. I can only tell you what it feels like to finally put your own name back in your own mouth, to have someone else recognize it without doubt, to watch the shadow finally step aside. It is quiet, yes, but it is everything. And to those of you listening, reading, or watching, if you have carried a label that was never yours, if you have felt the weight of someone else's certainty, I hope this story gives you courage. You do not have to live under it forever. You do not have to let it define you. Find your truth, speak your name, hold it, protect it, and sometimes let others learn it slowly, as my father did. Would you have done what I did? Would you have waited for the truth, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it meant confronting someone you loved? Or would you have run? Tell me in the comments. And if my story touched you, if it made you pause, reflect, or feel less alone, subscribe for more stories from my life and the lives that touch mine. Because even in ordinary houses, in ordinary families, in quiet afternoons with soup and letters, we find lessons worth sharing and courage worth keeping. Some stories don't end with fireworks. Some end with a cup of tea, a soft apology, and a name finally said right. And that, my friends, is enough. There's a certain quiet that comes after everything has been said. Not the silence that presses down on you, but the kind that hums gently in your chest, the kind that feels like a house finally exhaling. That's the quiet I live in now. After decades of being called the affair child, after whispers, assumptions, and mistakes that could have hardened any heart, I finally feel a sense of belonging in my own life, like I've been allowed to sit at the table and be counted, without footnotes, without shame, without fear. It didn't happen overnight. Healing rarely does. There were days when I thought the weight of my father's words, of the gossip and assumptions, would crush me entirely. Days when I wanted to scream, to run, to erase everything. And yet, each day, I chose something different, to speak my truth, to confront history, to stand quietly but firmly in the person I knew myself to be. It was exhausting, sometimes terrifying, and it was the only way I learned that I am not defined by what others claim about me. I am defined by what I choose to carry forward. The DNA test, simple in its mechanics, profound in its effect, was less about proving legitimacy and more about reclaiming identity. Holding those results in my hand, I felt years of tension melt into something I didn't have a word for yet. Relief, yes. Validation, yes. But also freedom. Freedom to live in the present without the weight of a label I had never asked for. Freedom to allow my father to learn the lesson he had been avoiding for decades. And freedom to create a life that belonged fully to me. After the letters, after the confrontations, after the public acknowledgement, my father and I began a new chapter. It was not dramatic or cinematic. There were no grand gestures or proclamations. Instead, it was the everyday things. A cup of tea shared in the morning light, a hand on my shoulder while folding laundry, a joke told badly and laughed at anyway. The oak outside his house became our witness, a quiet symbol of endurance, of time, and of the patience it takes to grow something strong after a storm. Lucy, of course, became the heart of all this. She didn't understand all the intricacies of the story, and that was fine. She understood love, attention, and fairness, and she demanded them without compromise. Watching her run through the yard, calling out to my father, laughing at his missteps, was a kind of healing I hadn't anticipated. Children have a way of sensing truth without needing to know the history behind it. And in seeing her joy, I realized the depth of the work my father and I had done, not to erase the past, but to make it lighter so that the next generation could move freely. Daniel noticed it too. He saw the calm in our home, the quiet understanding between me and my father that hadn't existed for years. He saw the slow rebuilding of trust and the gentle release of old fears, and he reminded me often that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes courage is simply showing up, day after day, and refusing to let someone else's assumptions define you. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the living room gold, my father and I sat together over tea. He held a letter I had written long ago but never sent, a letter full of questions, anger, and longing. He read it quietly, nodding as though he understood things he had never allowed himself to feel. And then, without a word, he reached out and touched my hand, not in apology, but in acknowledgement. It was a simple gesture, but it carried a weight far greater than anything I had ever expected. It said, without words, "I see you. I understand. I am learning." The moral of this story is not revenge. It is not retribution. It is not even validation. It is accountability, humility, and love. It is the understanding that the words we speak and the assumptions we make have power, and that power can either harm or heal. It is learning to say sorry in a way that is complete, and learning to forgive in a way that is true, not just to others, but to ourselves. Sometimes I still feel a flicker of the old anger, the old ache, when a neighbor misremembers the story, when a distant relative asks a question too pointed, when a social media post drifts across my screen. I feel it, but it doesn't stay. It passes like clouds over sunlight, leaving the warmth behind, and I am left with clarity. I am not the shadow of someone else's story. I am Elaine. I am a daughter, a mother, a partner, a friend. I am a person who has reclaimed her name and her life. I hope if you are listening, reading, or watching that you understand this. The labels others impose do not define your worth. The stories they tell about you are not your truth unless you allow them to be. You have the power to reclaim your narrative, to speak your name, to set down the weight of assumptions, and to live fully in your own life. Courage is not always dramatic. It is often quiet, persistent, and deeply personal. As I sit here watching Lucy draw with crayons on the kitchen table, my father humming softly in the background, Daniel chuckling at something only he finds funny, I feel a profound gratitude, not for the past, which hurt more than anyone could know, but for the resilience it demanded, the lessons it imparted, and the love that survived it all. So I ask you, gently, what story have you been carrying that isn't yours? What label has weighed on your shoulders for too long? How might your life change if you quietly reclaimed it day by day with honesty, patience, and love? And if this story has touched you, if it has made you pause, reflect, or feel less alone, I hope you will share it. Share your courage, your truth, and your presence. Because even in the ordinary moments, over tea, in letters, through laughter and tears, there is the extraordinary work of healing. There is the quiet heroism of reclaiming yourself. In the end, that is what matters. Not the accusations, not the gossip, not the mistakes of the past. What matters is presence. What matters is accountability. What matters is love that persists, even when it is quiet. And what matters most is that your name, your true name, is yours to say, yours to protect, and yours to live. I look at my father and smile. I look at Lucy and laugh. I look at Daniel and hold his hand. And I am home, finally, fully, unmistakably.